Hey everybody, welcome to Gen X Prof. I'm Mary Dixon, and today I want to talk to you about something that's really close to my heart, and that is ADHD in the classroom. Why is this close to my heart? Well, because my own daughter has ADHD. And for people like me who grew up of a certain age, those of us of Gen X, this is something that if we've already got someone in our family or who is close to us who has this diagnosis, or maybe we have it ourselves, we know a bit about. But for the rest of us, if this is new to you, you may have a very different understanding of what ADHD is. Your experience of it in the past may be very different. Understanding the diagnosis and how it's growing. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that today, and hopefully this is helpful to you as you think about this coming into your own classroom. So my own daughter was diagnosed with this a few years back, and when she received her diagnosis, it was after many years of being what you might consider a good student. Her teachers liked her. They thought that she was enthusiastic, that she was kind, that she was creative. And overall, she was a very clever child. But we kept getting a lot of small critiques. So, for example, she's disorganized. She doesn't remember things very well. She daydreams a bit, and sort of that flighty, daydreamy girl stereotype was put on her. She could focus, but only on activities that she really liked. So, for example, she loved crafting, and she could spend hours on a craft project. But when it came to something that didn't interest her as much, she just wasn't very focused on it. She additionally had real troubles with her handwriting. Her handwriting would just melt off the page. She still wrote numbers backwards, even into fourth and fifth grade. And we saw a lot of comments from teachers about her not moving into chapter books and really sticking with graphic novels and things that had visual representations. So all of this meant that she was getting a little bit sad about being a person who just wasn't as smart as some of the other kids in school. Now, we had no evidence she wasn't as smart. What we had evidence of was that the class that she was in just wasn't working for her. But this really started to affect her self-esteem. So we took her to our family psychologist, who spent a couple of hours with her and said, we might be looking at ADHD here. I'd like to have her tested. So we went ahead and did the testing, and I will be honest, it is a long process. It takes a couple of days to do the testing and then some time to get the test results back. It is not an inexpensive proposition. And in many cases, it's not covered by insurance. And so this was something that we had to really sit down and talk about and decide if we were going to invest in. And the answer was, of course, yes, we needed to do this for our child. The results came back that, yep, this is a child who not only has ADHD, but also has a bit of dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And we'll talk about those a little bit. What are they and how do they work with ADHD? So we took her in to see our family physician and mentioned the ADHD diagnosis, that we were ready to talk about getting some medication for her. And he said, well, I normally do my own set of evaluations. And as he was talking to me, my daughter had this stuffed pig, and she threw the pig up and she threw the pig down to the side, to the side, to the side, up. Pig was on her head. Pig was over here. Pig was over there. And within a few seconds, the doctor said, but I think in this case, we'll probably go ahead and see how she does on some medication. So we were lucky. We were able to get a diagnosis. We were able to get medical support. We were able to get medication that is covered by our insurance, and we were able to move forward. And we were able also to get testing that showed that in terms of intelligence, her intelligence is just south of a genius level. She is a really bright child, and that really helped with her self-esteem. I tell you all of this because I think it helps put into perspective what parents and children and families go through to get this diagnosis, to understand their children and what might have led them onto this path. So let's talk a little bit about ADHD and how it's probably affecting your classroom. So when we think about ADHD, one of the things we have to talk about is, what is it? Back in the olden days, when I grew up in the 1970s, kids who had ADHD were hyperactive. Typically, they were boys who couldn't sit still, who wouldn't follow directions. And most of the time, they ended up getting in a bit of trouble, or ended up being moved out of the classroom for a period of time. That doesn't give you a really good understanding or perspective on this at all, if that's what you grew up with. In fact, it's going to give you a very negative perspective, and it's going to give you a distorted understanding of what ADHD is. When we think about ADHD, my daughter likes to say it this way: attention deficit, hey, donuts. She also suggested I put a squirrel at the bottom of every slide because she feels that way, that there's so much distraction. She has what a lot of female patients have, which is an attention deficit without the hyperactivity. So hers is what we call an inattentive disorder. She just doesn't pay attention very well. And there are a lot of things that come with that. Now, there are people for whom sitting still is a big part of this. To some degree, that's true for her, but for the most part, for her, it's inattentive. But for people who can't sit still, that can be a real problem in a college classroom. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder may come with the hyperactivity or without. So in some cases, you'll hear people just say ADD, attention deficit disorder. And what that really is a physical difference in the brain. Why do I bring this up? This is important to me because it really helps me understand that a lot of the things that people do with ADHD students, it's like walking up to somebody who's blind and just say, focus harder on the paper and you'll be able to read. And that's not how it works. And there's a literal physical difference with the body and the brain. So when we think about ADHD and we're thinking about the brain, we need to understand what a different brain means. It means that there is a lower level of dopamine transporters. Dopamine is that thing that gives you that jolt of energy and happiness. If you think about the things that you do that you enjoy, that you get that dopamine hit. If you have a lower level of dopamine transporters, it means dopamine's not getting to you maybe as easily. You might need to do more things to get that same level of dopamine that somebody else has, which means you may be focused more on things, particularly that you enjoy. You're going to have different folds in the brain. What does that mean? Well, if you think about what a brain looks like, it has these crinkles, these folds in it. And somebody with ADHD has a different set of folds than somebody who doesn't. So the actual structure of the brain is different. There's also less tissue in the prefrontal and temporal lobes. And those are the ones that actually work with memory. So you can see why memory would be affected here. And there's a reduction in the total brain volume. So literally a bit of a smaller brain than somebody without ADHD. So you can see these are not things that you could just hope away or work harder, and it just isn't true. It is. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do to mitigate some of what this means in your day-to-day life. And those are some of the things we want to help our students understand. So what's affected here? Well, the affected regions of the brain are going to be those that control attention, regulate emotion, and control motivation. And those are three really important areas, particularly for somebody going to college. So first, let's think about attention. How much time do you expect a student to pay attention, to listen, to focus in your class? If it's a lot of time, for some of us, it could even be a full 50 minutes of a lecture. That can be a real challenge. We're going to talk about that later. So thinking about controlling your attention span. The second is regulating emotion. So think about how overwhelmed some of us get, even when we're frustrated with small tasks, and magnify that. So those emotions that help us stay calm, avoid anxiety, those emotional regulators are affected by ADHD. And then controlling motivation. This one is so frustrating as both a parent and a college professor, because I really want my students to be motivated to do great work. That means I have to give them a hook. I have to give them something that motivates them to do that work, because a lot of the times they don't naturally feel motivated the way that you and I might feel motivated. If you haven't seen the TED Talk on procrastination, it's a fantastic one because it really does a great humorous job of talking about what ends up motivating us to do things that maybe we're really not that interested in or don't seem that important. For an ADHD person, that motivation is even lower and harder to generate. So we really have to think about how we get an ADHD student motivated to do work, particularly work they don't necessarily want to do and feel as important and interesting to them. So ADHD then affects the brain structure, it affects the function, and it affects the development. That's a lot for a college student when you think about it. So we want to think then, who's going to be affected? Well, if you're like me as a Gen X prof, I started out with very few accommodations in my classes. And most of those accommodations were for things like sight or for hearing or other disabilities. I didn't have that many related to ADHD. But in the past 5 years, this has really, really increased. So I'm now seeing anywhere between 3 and 5 of these a semester, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's certainly an increase. And every semester, I have more and more students coming to me with a diagnosis of ADHD that a lot of times they're getting while they're in school, because if they weren't diagnosed when they were younger, because this is something that's increasingly becoming something we're aware of, then they're getting that diagnosis now. And they're not even sure what to ask for in terms of accommodations, et cetera. So what we know is this number is changing, and it's changing constantly. But we estimate that between 9 and 14% of kids aged 3 to 17 are getting some type of ADHD diagnosis. So if we take that number and we push it into the future, it is not going to be long, only a couple of years, before that percentage of students potentially could be in our classes with ADHD. So that's something that should give us pause and make us think a little bit more about how we're teaching students who have ADHD. So when we think about diagnosis rates, they do differ by race, by parental education, by poverty level. And again, these numbers are constantly churning. And I've got all this data for you at the end so that you can take a look at it and make some decisions for yourself. But what we know is that we see a huge increase in these populations. So if we're looking at, move this out of the way, 11 to 17-year-olds, we can see they represent this green line on the right-hand side. So 18.1% total of 11 to 17-year-olds, whereas 3 to 10-year-olds are 10.1%. And we would expect that that means that this is something that's getting diagnosed mostly in junior high, high school, or those later years of grade school. But we can see when we look at his non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, and Hispanic levels that non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic white numbers are much higher than Hispanic levels. But we also know from previous research that Hispanic levels have been growing increasingly each year. So this is becoming a diagnosis that more and more Hispanic children are receiving as well. So these numbers are constantly changing, but I think it shows just how many students are coming in with this diagnosis. So for those of us who serve Hispanic serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, very diverse colleges, we really need to pay attention to these particular numbers. All right, now how does this change learning? Now, this is the piece that I've had to really think about. Not only because I'm a college professor and I care about my students, but because I'm a mom. And as a mom, I need to understand, why does my daughter learn differently from my son? And I think about it this way. It's not that my daughter is not as smart as my son. I've got the data on that. I know they're pretty equal. The difference is that schools and educational systems are made for my son. They're just not particularly made for my daughter. And so when we think about learning changes, we really want to think about what is happening with their executive functioning skills. Now, what do we mean by executive functioning skills? Well, what is it that gets you up in the morning, gets you to do the things you need to be successful, gets you to manage your schedule, your calendar, your email, check your phone messages, get the work done that you need in terms of your grading, all of these different things? That's your executive functioning. It's the thing that lets you function on a high level to accomplish day-to-day tasks that make you successful at whatever it is that you do. So when we're talking about poor executive functioning skills, we're really talking about things like self-control. Do you have the control to stop the thing that you're doing, like maybe binge watching the entire series of Emily in Paris or Wednesday, and then go to class or start your homework? Can you self-monitor? Do you know how long you've spent watching Wednesday or Emily in Paris? Can you pay attention to whether or not you're paying attention? Do you have emotional control? Can you maintain an even emotional state even when things get stressful or anxious? Can you be flexible? So if I changed a deadline on a student, could that student roll with the punches? If you're in a group project and somebody doesn't get their piece done, can you be flexible with the deadline? That sort of rigidness can really affect a student's ability to be successful. Task initiation and completion. Can you look at a deadline and really estimate how much time it's going to take you to get it started and get it finished and meet a particular deadline? Can you get it started and finish it all the way to completion? If it's a really big task, that may not happen. Organization, for example, is another related task to that. Can you organize a task, a room, a calendar in a way that it makes sense to you? Do you have strong working memory? You will find that many students with ADHD really struggle with tests or with projects or with anything that requires memorization. Writing things down is the stock and trade of an ADHD student. And then planning and time management. This gets with that task initiation and completion. Can you plan your semester out? Can you plan your week out? Can you plan your day out? And can you manage time so that you don't miss important deadlines, that you make it to class on time, that you get to work on time? All of these different things. Are you leaving enough time to get from your apartment to class or to get from your apartment to work? That's all executive functioning. Let's look at a really specific example. My daughter's room, it's a mess. In fact, we sort of have a deal that she's going to just make a path for me. And we'll go through that path in the morning so that I can make sure that I can wake her up. So when we look at all of these different pieces, we can see that for her, things like organization and planning and time management and task initiation and completion really come into play. When we first got her ADHD diagnosis and I looked at the messy room and she was about 9 or 10, I was finally understanding why it looked that way. It wasn't because she wanted a messy room. It was because saying, put your laundry away was too big a task. So we would break it down. Why don't you put your socks away? So she would just put her socks away. And I would say, great job. And a little while later, I'd say, why don't we just put the underwear away? And we just put the underwear away. And then I would say, why don't you just fold your shirts? We don't even have to put them away. Just fold them and put them in a pile and we'll deal with them later. And we started breaking the task up into little bits with big breaks in between. And it became more manageable and less overwhelming. And so that's an example of organization, task initiation and completion, and planning and time management that really demonstrates how complicated it can be to do a simple task like putting your laundry away and keeping your room clean. So what are the challenges that we're talking about? Well, number one, remembering assignments. If you are a student with ADHD, remembering assignments is going to be difficult. You're going to need a system of reminders, a system that is right in front of you. Writing down in a notebook where you're never going to see it again is really, really challenging. It's very much out of sight, out of mind for ADHD students. So if it's written down, but it's written down in pages that you're literally not working on right then, you're not going to see them. Memorizing. Huge challenge for ADHD students. I remember working with my daughter on her Texas STAR test, which is our math test that determines whether or not you get to go on to the next grade level. And she had a horrible time trying to pass this test because it required her to memorize things and do things in a specific order. She knew how to do the math. She just couldn't remember formulas. She couldn't remember very specific information. But when she had refreshed it, she's like, oh, I know how to do that. And so there's a real memorization issue there. That gets to that complicated math. A student who has to remember different functions is going to have more trouble with complicated math. There are going to be self-esteem issues. If you are already not sure you belong in college, perhaps your grades were difficult, perhaps your SAT, ACT, not great because of the memorization issue and the time issue, then you're going to have low self-esteem walking in the door. And When a professor hands you back a D or an F with a lot of negative comments, that's going to hit that self-esteem harder. And it's going to make it even harder to motivate yourself to go to class and do the work. And it just makes you want to drop out. Time management. Yes, these students struggle with time management and they need help thinking about how much time it ought to take to do any given task. We'll talk a little bit about how we can make that work. And then sitting still. If you are a student with ADHD, sitting and listening for an hour is a lot. And so we need to think about how are we changing up our classroom dynamics to make this better for them. So what is a comorbidity? I mentioned these earlier, that you end up with more than one thing. So comorbidity is something that goes with your diagnosis. So in addition to ADHD, you may also have dysgraphia, which could be a writing issue. So if you're one of those professors who says you have to take all your notes in your handwriting, that might sink an ADHD student, because for a student like mine, whose handwriting literally melts off the page, or they can't read their own handwriting, particularly if they have to write quickly, that's problematic. Dyscalculia. So this is a math issue, and we've talked a little bit about it, how complex math can be difficult. And in the case of my own daughter, how she still writes numbers backwards sometimes. Dyslexia. This is a reading issue, which means it could take a lot longer for a student to finish any kind of reading assignment that you give. And then anxiety. What kind of mental health issues are underneath all of the ADHD? Your ADHD students also might be on different medications. I've mentioned my own daughter, she takes Adderall, and we monitor her dose, but it does give her side effects. They can be appetite related, they could be emotionally related, they can be energy related. And these medications could be mixed with other medications related to the anxiety or depression or other issues that they may have. So medications can be something we have to think about. All right, in our next video, we're going to talk about ADHD specifically in college. And as any good ADHD Gen X prof, I want to make sure that you have a break. So please head on over to the second video and I will see you over there. And thank you so much for joining me for this particular talk.